Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're taking a closer look at the life of J.R.R. Tolkien.
One of the greatest fantasy authors of all time.
Exactly. And, we're going to be using Humphrey Carpenter's biography as our main source.
A fantastic resource for anyone who wants to understand Tolkien beyond The Lord of the Rings.
Right. I mean, everyone knows The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
But there's so much more to discover about the man behind those incredible stories.
Absolutely. Like, for instance...
Did you know that Tolkien was born in South Africa?
Wait, really? I had no idea.
Yep. Bloemfontein in 1892.
Wow, that's not something you'd expect.
I know, right? But his family moved back to England when he was just 4 years old.
So not much of a South African childhood then?
Not really. But they settled in this village called Sarehole near Birmingham.
Sarehole. Is that important?
Oh, it's hugely important. Carpenter describes it as this idyllic place, almost like a real-life shire, meadows and mills, the River Cole.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection to the Shire now.
And this idyllic setting had a profound impact on Tolkien, shaping his imagination and instilling in him a deep love for nature.
So those descriptions of the Shire, the peaceful countryside, the Hobbit's love of gardening, that all comes from his childhood.
Absolutely. But there's also a darker side to the story of Sarehole.
Oh, what happened?
Well, during Tolkien's youth, Sarehole was swallowed up by industry.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the mills expanded, factories were built, and the countryside that Tolkien loved was destroyed.
That's heartbreaking. I can see how that would affect someone deeply, especially someone as sensitive to nature as Tolkien.
Exactly. And Carpenter suggests that this experience, this sense of loss and the encroachment of industry on a world that was once beautiful and pure, had a profound impact on Tolkien's worldview.
It's like that quote from The Lord of the Rings where Treebeard says, "The forests have ears and leaves have tongues."
That's a great connection. It shows how Tolkien's personal experiences found their way into his work, even in subtle ways.
And this sense of loss isn't just about Sarehole, is it? Didn't he lose his mother when he was quite young?
He did, sadly, when he was just 12 years old.
Wow, that must have been devastating.
It was a defining moment in his life. His mother had converted to Catholicism and faced a lot of opposition from her family.
Oh, wow.
But she held firm to her faith, and Tolkien deeply admired her courage and conviction.
I can see how that would shape his own faith and worldview.
Absolutely. And, Carpenter suggests that his mother's death, this sense of profound loss at such a young age, contributed to Tolkien's understanding of good and evil, sacrifice and redemption.
It's fascinating how these early experiences, the beauty of Sarehole, the tragedy of his mother's death, all played a role in shaping the themes that would later emerge in his writing.
It's almost like those experiences planted the seeds for Middle-earth, even though he wouldn't start creating that world for many years to come.
So we have the landscapes, the personal tragedies, but what about the language? When does Tolkien, the philologist, the lover of languages, emerge?
Well, his fascination with language started much earlier than you might think.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Carpenter mentions this incident where Tolkien was captivated by the Welsh words he saw in coal trucks as a boy.
He was fascinated by words on coal trucks.
Yes, he loved the sounds, the shapes of the letters.
That's incredible. It's like he was drawn to language from a very young age.
It seems that way. And his love for language only grew when he discovered a primer of the Gothic language a few years later.
Gothic.
Yep. He described it as at least as full of delight as first looking into Chapman's Homer.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
I know, right? It shows how deeply he was moved by language, even as a teenager.
So was he already creating languages at that point?
Well, he started inventing his own extra Gothic words.
Extra Gothic.
Yeah, he was playing around with the language, experimenting with sounds and structure.
So he was basically creating his own languages as a teenager.
Exactly. He was already building his own linguistic worlds, even then.
It's amazing to think that the seeds of Quenya and Sindarin, the Elvish languages he'd later create for Middle-earth, were already being sown.
It's like his mind was this fertile ground for linguistic creativity.
It's so cool.
I know, right? And this fascination with language would only intensify when he went to Oxford, where he was surrounded by even more languages and the inspiration that would lead him to create Middle-earth.
Oxford. The next chapter in his story, the place where his love of language blossomed even further.
That's where things really start to get interesting.
I can't wait to hear more. But we'll have to save that for the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life of J.R.R. Tolkien. Last time, we left off with Tolkien at Oxford. He was a professor, and The Hobbit was published.
A significant moment.
Mm-hmm.
The Hobbit was a hit. Readers were charmed. But Tolkien
He wasn't content to just rest on his laurels.
Not exactly. Even as The Hobbit was being celebrated, he felt this pull
To do what?
to go deeper. He wanted to create something more, something grander, more complex. And he had this whole world, Middle-earth.
Right, that he'd been developing for years.
Yes. And he saw The Hobbit as just a glimpse, a small window into this vast world he'd created.
So it wasn't a case of, the publisher saying, hey, we need a sequel. Hobbits are hot right now.
Well, his publisher, Stanley Unwin, definitely wanted another Hobbit book.
I bet he did.
But Tolkien resisted that. He didn't want to just rehash the same thing. He had bigger ambitions.
He wanted to explore Middle-earth in more depth.
Exactly. He wanted to connect this new story to his broader mythology, to the world he'd been building for years.
So how did The Lord of the Rings come out of this? What was the spark?
Tolkien was wrestling with two things, two desires. On the one hand, he wanted to explore the deeper history and mythology of Middle-earth, all the stuff that's hinted at in The Hobbit, but never fully explained.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like he was setting the stage for something bigger.
Right. And on the other hand, he felt this responsibility
To who?
to his readers, especially the younger ones. He felt like he owed them another story about hobbits.
So he was torn between these two paths, the scholarly exploration of his mythology and
The desire to give readers another fun adventure with hobbits.
tough choice. So how'd he resolve it?
He found a way to weave them together. He started working on a new story, initially as a sequel to The Hobbit,
Okay.
but it quickly transformed into something much grander. The hobbits were still there,
Of course.
but this time their adventure was set against this much larger and darker backdrop. A world on the brink of war,
The stakes were higher.
much higher. And that's how The Lord of the Rings was born. It allowed Tolkien to satisfy both of his desires, to tell a captivating story about hobbits and to explore his deeper mythological ideas.
Brilliant. He used the hobbits as this entry point into this vast and complex world.
Exactly. He gave readers what they wanted, hobbits, but he also drew them into this incredibly rich and detailed world that he'd been building for years.
I can only imagine writing The Lord of the Rings was a massive undertaking.
It was. It took him over a decade to write.
Each decade.
Yep. Tolkien was juggling his academic duties, his family life, and this epic saga that was unfolding in his mind. Carpenter's biography paints this picture of Tolkien working late into the night, surrounded by stacks of papers, his study filled with maps and charts of Middle-earth.
Wow. Okay, so it's 1930s. Tolkien is in his 40s. He's this respected Oxford professor, a family man, and he's got this massive project going on top of everything else. How did he manage it all?
Well, Tolkien had an incredible work ethic. He was dedicated. But it wasn't just about the time he put in. Tolkien was incredibly meticulous in his research. He's a scholar, remember. He wanted his world to feel real, to have this depth of history.
And it shows in the books. The level of detail is astounding. It's like reading a history book of a world that never existed.
Exactly. Tolkien wanted his readers to feel like they were discovering a lost history, not just reading a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
And he achieved that through this incredible attention to detail, this depth of world building that's rarely seen in other fantasy works.
And this wasn't just about maps and timelines. Tolkien brought this personal touch to the world of Middle-earth. Like, Carpenter mentions that Tolkien's study overlooked his garden.
Oh, yes, I love that detail.
And he would often gaze out at the trees and the flowers, finding inspiration in the natural world.
Beautiful imagery. And you can feel that love for nature, that connection to the natural world in his writing.
I can totally picture him looking out at a particular oak tree in his garden and thinking, yep, that's an Ent.
That's Tolkien, drawing inspiration from the world around him.
But writing The Lord of the Rings wasn't a solitary pursuit, was it? He had the Inklings.
Ah, yes, the Inklings.
For those who don't know, who were the Inklings?
They were an informal literary discussion group in Oxford. They'd meet regularly, usually in pubs, or sometimes in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College.
C.S. Lewis, the author of The Chronicles of Narnia.
The very same. Tolkien and Lewis were close friends, and the Inklings was this space where they could share their work, their ideas, and give each other feedback.
So they were like the ultimate writer's support group.
Exactly. A group of brilliant minds bouncing ideas off each other, critiquing each other's work.
I bet those meetings were fascinating. Did Tolkien share The Lord of the Rings with the Inklings?
Oh, absolutely. He'd read chapters aloud, get their feedback, and their input was invaluable to him.
Imagine being a fly on the wall during those readings, hearing Tolkien's words come to life, and then listening to the discussions afterward.
I know, right? It must have been incredible. And we know that C.S. Lewis, in particular, was a huge champion of The Lord of the Rings from the very beginning.
Yeah, I can see him being really encouraging, pushing Tolkien to keep going, to believe in the story.
And it wasn't just encouragement. Lewis also provided specific feedback, like he helped Tolkien refine the character of Gollum.
Gollum.
Yep. Initially, Gollum wasn't as complex. Lewis helped Tolkien flesh out the character.
Wow, so even Gollum, one of the most iconic characters in literature, benefited from the Inkling's input.
It shows how valuable those discussions were. And it wasn't just The Lord of the Rings that benefited from these exchanges. Tolkien would also share excerpts from the Silmarillion, his mythology of Middle-earth, which he was working on at the same time.
It's amazing to think that these two monumental works were being developed side by side, each informing the other.
A testament to Tolkien's creative genius. But it's important to remember that Tolkien wasn't just this solitary scholar, this world builder. He was also a family man.
He had a life outside of Oxford and Middle-earth.
Of course. He and Edith had 4 children, and Tolkien was deeply involved in their lives.
That's sweet. Was he a good dad?
Carpenter describes him as a devoted father. He told them bedtime stories, took them on walks, invented games for them.
Oh, that's adorable. I can't help but think of Bilbo and Frodo, that sense of familial love, the passing down of stories and traditions from one generation to the next.
It's definitely there in Tolkien's work, this deep appreciation for family.
And it's not just family. Tolkien also loved nature. He enjoyed gardening, going for long walks, and he even had this quirky habit. Oh.
Tell me.
He loved playing patience.
Really? Patience?
Yeah. Carpenter mentions it several times. Tolkien would relax by playing patience. He even invented his own variations of the game.
It's funny to imagine the creator of Middle-earth, this master of language and mythology, unwinding with a game of patience.
I know. It shows that even the greatest minds need time to relax and recharge.
But even in his leisure time, Tolkien's mind was never far from language. He was constantly creating new languages, alphabets, writing systems. It was like this endless wellspring of linguistic creativity.
Language was his lifeblood.
It truly was.
Yeah.
But there's another side to Tolkien that often gets overlooked. He was also quite a talented artist.
Really? I had no idea.
Yep. He created beautiful illustrations for his own stories. He worked in watercolor, ink, pencil. His style was unique, very influenced by his love of nature and medieval art.
Wow. I'd love to see some of his artwork.
They're worth seeking out. It's amazing to see how his artistic talents complemented his writing.
Like he had this multifaceted creative energy that just flowed out of him.
Exactly. Language, stories, art, it was all connected for Tolkien. But as we know, the world was about to change dramatically with the outbreak of World War II.
And how did the war affect Tolkien?
Deeply. Just like World War I, World War II had a profound impact on him. He was troubled by the violence and destruction.
Of course.
But he also saw these parallels.
Between what?
Between the events of the real world and the struggles he depicted in The Lord of the Rings. The rise of a dark power, the fight for freedom, the importance of courage and sacrifice. It's all there.
It's like he was writing a commentary on the real world through this fantastical lens.
In a way, yes. And Tolkien actually wrote letters to his son, Christopher, who was serving in the RAF during the war, drawing these connections between the war and the fight against Sauron.
It's fascinating how those real-world events mirrored the themes he was exploring in his fiction.
And it's worth noting that Tolkien continued to work on The Lord of the Rings throughout the war.
Even amidst the chaos and uncertainty.
Yes. He found solace and meaning in the story's themes of hope and resilience. It's like that line from Samwise Gamgee, "There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for."
Such a powerful message, especially in the context of war.
Absolutely. Tolkien's work offered this beacon of light, this reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope endures.
And as the war came to an end, The Lord of the Rings was nearing completion.
A long journey from those initial ideas to the years of writing and revising, all set against the backdrop of war and personal challenges.
It's incredible to think about. But the story of The Lord of the Rings wasn't over yet. The publication of the book would bring new challenges, unexpected fame, and a legacy that continues to shape the world today.
Right, the next chapter was just beginning. And it's just as fascinating.
Filled with twists and turns.
Join us for part 3, where we'll explore the publication of The Lord of the Rings, its impact, and the final years of Tolkien's incredible life.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the life of J.R.R. Tolkien. We've covered so much ground already: his childhood, his love of language, the creation of The Lord of the Rings.
An incredible journey so far.
And now we reach a turning point, the publication of The Lord of the Rings. After over a decade of writing and revising, it's finally ready for the world. Can you imagine the anticipation, the nerves?
Yo, absolutely. It must have been such a mix of excitement and anxiety for Tolkien. This story, this world that he'd poured so much of himself into, it was about to be judged by the public.
You know, it makes me think about those early reactions to The Hobbit when it was first published. Some critics loved it, but others found it, well, a bit childish. Did Tolkien worry about that happening again with The Lord of the Rings?
I think it's safe to say he did, especially considering the scope and complexity of The Lord of the Rings. It wasn't just another lighthearted adventure like The Hobbit. This was something much bigger, much more ambitious.
And speaking of ambitious, didn't Tolkien initially want to publish The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion together as one giant volume?
He did. He saw them as interconnected parts of a larger whole. But his publisher,
Alan and Unwin?
right, they weren't so keen on the idea. They were worried about the length, the cost, the potential for confusion among readers.
I can understand their hesitation. It's a lot to throw at readers, especially those who might not be familiar with Tolkien's world.
Exactly. And ultimately, they decided to publish The Lord of the Rings in 3 separate volumes.
The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King.
The iconic trilogy we know and love today.
But can you imagine if they'd gone with Tolkien's original plan? One massive volume containing both The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion? That would have been a beast of a book.
It certainly would have, but I think, in hindsight, the decision to publish it as a trilogy was the right one.
It made the story more accessible.
More digestible.
Exactly. But even as a trilogy, it's still a pretty hefty read. So how was it received when it was first published? Did it become an instant classic?
It wasn't an overnight sensation, but it quickly gained a devoted following. Readers were drawn to the depth of Tolkien's world, the complex characters,
And those timeless themes.
of good versus evil, courage, friendship, the power of hope. Those themes resonated deeply with a world that had just emerged from the darkness of World War II.
People were hungry for stories that celebrated the human spirit. Stories that offered hope in a world that had seen so much suffering.
And The Lord of the Rings provided that. It offered an escape,
A journey into a world where good triumphs over evil.
a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
It's a powerful message.
It is. But of course, not everyone loved The Lord of the Rings. There were critics who found it too long, too detailed, too steeped in fantasy.
It's funny because those are the very things that so many readers love about Tolkien's work. The world building, the attention to detail, the depth of mythology. It's what sets him apart.
Exactly. And while some might find it overwhelming, others find it utterly captivating.
It's like stepping into another world, a world that feels real, lived.
Tolkien's attention to detail creates that sense of immersion.
It's like you can smell the pine needles in the forest, feel the wind on your face as you cross the plains of Rohan.
You're right there with the characters, experiencing their triumphs and their struggles.
And it's not just the setting. The characters are so well developed, so relatable.
From the hobbits, with their simple pleasures and surprising courage, to the wise wizards and noble elves.
Even the villains are compelling. Gollum, for instance, he's both repulsive and pitiable. You can't help but feel a bit sorry for him.
That's the mark of a great writer, to create characters that are complex, nuanced, even the villains.
Absolutely. But I'm curious, how did Tolkien handle the fame that came with the success of The Lord of the Rings? He wasn't exactly known for being a public figure.
It wasn't. And from what Carpenter tells us, he struggled with it. The attention, the fan mail, the requests for interviews, it all became a bit overwhelming for him.
I can imagine. He was a scholar at heart, a man who valued privacy and solitude.
But despite his discomfort with fame, there's also this sense that he appreciated the impact his work was having on people's lives. He understood the power of stories,
To inspire,
to uplift.
to transport us to other worlds.
Exactly. And he was grateful that The Lord of the Rings was bringing joy and hope to so many readers.
That's really heartwarming. Even as his book was becoming an international phenomenon, he continued teaching at Oxford.
Teaching was his passion. It was a core part of who he was.
And even after he retired, he never stopped working. He was determined to finish the Silmarillion, his grand mythology of Middle-earth.
The Silmarillion was his life's work.
But it wasn't published during his lifetime, was it?
No, it wasn't. Tolkien struggled to bring it to a final form,
It was a massive undertaking.
encompassing the entire history of Middle-earth, from its creation to the events of The Lord of the Rings.
It's like trying to write the history of the universe.
Exactly. And Tolkien constantly revised and rewrote it, striving for a level of perfection that perhaps wasn't attainable.
It's like he had this vision in his mind, this perfect version of the Silmarillion, but he could never quite capture it on paper.
I think that's a struggle that many artists face, the gap between the vision and the reality.
The pursuit of perfection.
But sadly, Tolkien passed away in 1973 without seeing the Silmarillion published.
It's a bittersweet ending to his story.
It is. But thankfully, his son, Christopher Tolkien, dedicated himself to editing and compiling his father's unfinished manuscripts.
A labor of love.
And in 1977, the Silmarillion was finally published, giving readers a glimpse into the vast and intricate mythology that underpins The Lord of the Rings.
It's an incredible legacy, and it's a testament to the enduring power of Tolkien's imagination that his work continues to resonate with readers of all ages, decades after his death.
Absolutely. His stories have inspired countless writers, artists, filmmakers. There's a whole world of Tolkien scholarship, fan fiction, art.
Even languages. People are still learning Quenya and Sindarin, the elvish languages Tolkien created.
It's remarkable, and it shows how deeply his work has touched people's lives.
But beyond the movies, the merchandise, the fandom, there's something deeper, something timeless about Tolkien's work that keeps drawing us back. What do you think it is?
I think it's that sense of wonder, that exploration of timeless themes. Good versus evil, courage, sacrifice, friendship. And it's the power of language. Tolkien's use of language is so rich, so evocative, it transports you to another world.
It's a world that feels both familiar and utterly unique. A world where ancient myths and legends intertwine with everyday human experiences.
It's a world that invites us to dream, to imagine, to believe in something beyond ourselves.
And in a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, I think that's a powerful and necessary gift.
I agree. As we wrap up this deep dive into the life of J.R.R. Tolkien, it's important to remember that he was more than just a writer, more than just a scholar. He was a man who loved language, who found joy in the simple things, who cherished his family and friends.
And those aspects of his life, they're woven into the very fabric of his work. They give his stories a depth and richness that transcends genre and time.
Beautifully said. Tolkien's legacy is a testament to the power of imagination, the enduring appeal of myth and legend, the importance of finding beauty and meaning in a world that often feels dark and chaotic.
It's been an incredible journey exploring his life and work. For anyone listening who wants to delve deeper, I encourage you to pick up Carpenter's biography, explore the Silmarillion, lose yourself in the world of The Lord of the Rings.
Tolkien's world is vast, and there's always something new to discover.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life of J.R.R. Tolkien.
It's been a pleasure.